All right, welcome back, friends. It's time for another day-to-day dev, and a whole bunch of stuff has happened. First of which is we have a question from the crowd. One of the homies, Ryan, is trying to get through a complicated game design, I think, and come together to figure out exactly what he is going to bring to a playtesting event that we have today, the day that the podcast is released. And then the other thing that I want to cover is I've been working on something new and exciting.
Oh, great.
But we'll come back to that later. So yeah, the first thing, basically, quick recap. Ryan built up this big document, which was kind of like, here's all my ideas, here's the kind of outcomes and stuff that I want to have. All these kind of different things, and was like, here's my thoughts, here's what I'm trying to do. And the game itself is basically all of the like a donut of ideas, where the central thing that he is trying to really figure out what it's supposed to be. Because we've seen a couple of different math systems. I've played test this game twice, each with different resolution mechanics, I guess is the way to say it. And I think that is the main thing that needs to be decided, right? And he's brought up a couple of different ones, and we've put a couple of things together, and I have a feeling that he's struggling with just committing to something, or like really knowing what the best of something is. And so he's come to us and asked, is it too early to be playtesting? Should I, wait and come back? Should I just kind of put together something and take it and try and get some feedback? I think this is a good point. Normally for me, I smash something together and it's either a whole idea or it's not a whole idea. And like maybe that's just something I've instinctively gotten used to because I've been doing this for a while. And I'll have not a whole idea and I'll just be naturally kind of mulling on it. And I would not have built a prototype. Right? Whereas something else where I have a good idea of, and it's not outside of my workshop abilities, then I would just build a prototype and then go and test it and get some ideas and stuff like that. Whereas Steve is known for just, even on the day, scribbling some texture on some cards and trying out some things. Just get a look at the idea on. But I guess the question to ask is, when is it too early to playtest?
Yeah, I think this is a question that people, when they're designing early on, find really difficult to get a hang on. I know I did when I was when I was first making games. It was very difficult to know when you had something that might work, and sometimes I would just feel like I was completely lost, and I was like, oh no, that isn't a mechanic. I'd start to build it, and it would fall apart. And sometimes I made like 100 cards and went, oh no, this doesn't work at all, which is very dissatisfying and demoralizing. But I think there's no real way to learn this skill except through experience.
Or failing several times.
Yeah,
I've run
right.
playtests of stuff where I've been in physical anguish the entire time. Like, the kind of like where you have opened up your diary and someone is reading your most private, horrible, cringy thoughts kind of anguish. Where I'm like, hey, this is a game that I put together. And I'm like, even just explaining it, like the playing hasn't even started yet. I'm like, this is actually horrible. I hate every second of this. And I think maybe you have to do that one or two times to, as a designer, go, you know what, actually, maybe this is a banger. Maybe I should not have come this far. Like, maybe forethought a bit more in the developing the prototype or something.
Yeah, I mean, as I say though, it is hard, but yeah, I think the first step is test it with yourself. That can really help. Like I've had at least maybe a dozen or 20 games that I've made cards for. I've sat on my bed, I've dealt them out, and go, no, this doesn't work. This just isn't a game, and that saves you the embarrassment. But you might not be able to tell until you're holding the cards in your hand. Like that's the thing. You might just, it's that physical part of great game design that unlocks in your kinesthetic brain. Like some people, I think, have better brains for that, but others don't. And yeah, you sometimes you just have to make a prototype and watch it fail to go, oh, that wasn't anything.
Well, I guess think of it
Um,
like the video game analogy, right? Until you've hit compile and you've clicked play in the launcher and the game comes back with an error message, do you know that it's not ready to play?
yeah,
And I
no.
think this might be the same thing.
Yeah, we'd like to think that we could sort of build it in our brains, and then all we need to do is turn it into a physical thing, but it doesn't work like that.
Hmm.
There is somewhere along the process of making it something physical that actually gets your brain to work properly. And that's why, yeah, when I run my workshops, I try to get people really quickly out of the planning phase and into the
Hmm.
we're making a card, we're putting cards into a deck, um, because that shifts your brain into the right mode. So it's probably never too early to prototype as long as you're happy to fail,
Hmm.
and to learn from that failure. Um, but it does. What can happen though is you get something that's sort of halfway there, and then you're like, well, what do I do now?
Hmm.
How
What's the
do
other
I
half
figure?
look like?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And yeah, that can be a difficult thing to deal with. Sometimes there isn't an answer, and
Hmm.
sometimes playtesting can help, and sometimes it can't. It depends on how you do it and who you do it with, and what sort of position you're in with your brain. Um, because it's easy to sort of bring something that's sort of half formed, and then get a lot of suggestions, and then go, well, none of those seem to be right,
Yeah.
because the problem's actually that you have some idea that you can't quite see.
Hmm.
But if you're ready to sort of go, almost like a co-working thing. If you're ready to put it down in front of someone and go, I need the other half and I'm ready to take your idea,
Hmm.
then then you might be able to get something out of it. You can just go to people and go, look, I've got this weird mechanic, but I have no idea what the setting might be, um or the theme I've got like a sort of a structure that I'm going to, but can you think of any mechanic that would be better here?
Hmm.
Like you've got to give if you're taking it to a table of playtesters, whether they're regular gamers or your family and friends or game designers, you need to sort of approach it with something concrete for them to latch onto, and a sense of what do I want to get from you? Like
Yeah. I
it's
feel like
like
you
it
have
has
to
to be.
act like it's finished.
Yeah, that's right. It has to have some sort of ability to have. Well, you have to be able to set it up,
Hmm.
play around, and have some idea of how it scores,
Hmm.
so that people can look at that and play it and go, okay, um, and then give you some sort of thoughts on it and have an idea of what thoughts you want.
Hmm.
That's the other thing. It's like if you go, "Nah," they're like, well, I don't know. But if you're like,
Yeah.
everything's right except the mechanic, or throw random brainstorming ideas about me for X,
Hmm.
then they've got, oh, okay, right. Well, it reminded me a bit of this and that, and
Hmm.
um, I can see that it could be a game about coffee shops or something,
I
and
feel
you'd be like,
like
right,
in feedback, right? Game designers will give you very specific feedback about the game design, but I think that the average member of the public or your family member or your dog are going to give you feedback that's like either really generalized or really not sure what to comment on beyond like,
yeah,
yeah, nice, I had fun and I don't want to upset you. And I feel like having really direct questions about specific parts of it preloaded and ready to go, which are
yeah,
just things you're anxious about or things that you weren't sure about when you put in there. Like, there's been times when I've built a game and I've been like, here's the thing that I'm really confident in. I think this is fucking amazing. And there's other bits which are just stolen from other games to fill a slot until I figure out what actually really needs to work properly.
yeah,
And then until someone comments about it, it might make it until the final version. All right?
mm,
Like, but if you ask about it, you're going to get a better sense of, does this fit here? Is it actually good? Is this balanced? What was your feeling about it?
yeah,
Which I think is kind of important to understand what kind of feedback is going to be relevant to your early prototype or even your late prototype, really.
yeah,
But the other thing is, I think, and we always come back to this, I guess, is the hobby designer versus career designer, right? Because I have a
hmm,
hunch that when it comes to is it too early to play test, the hobby designer has a big advantage because the hobby designer has been daydreaming about this for way longer than they rightfully should have. And when they've finally committed to making something real and putting it onto paper, making a prototype, then I think the game is going to be much more fleshed out and put together, because this is the one game that they intend to make. Like they're intending to go into game design to make this one product exist, and in that case, when you have your prototype, you're ready to playtest. Like you've just naturally kind of come to that conclusion, I think. Whereas for a career designer, when you're just making a ton of shit because you're just throwing ideas out there and you're building stuff, it's kind of a lot harder to know if something is half baked or if something is an exercise in making sure you fully understand how to implement something.
Yeah.
Like we played a game that I made about diffusing a bomb. I don't know if you remember, and basically, you couldn't communicate except with these cards that had like a Facebook status on it, basically, which was like "Don't tell me things" or whatever.
Yeah.
And immediately upon playing the game, we realized that there was just paradoxes in it that made it basically unplayable that we had to solve on the spot. And I'm like, this is clearly something that I could not have seen in advance, or I would have fixed it.
Yeah.
But only through playtesting was it now super obvious because it just happened immediately.
Yeah.
And I think that's also like, even if you could just make a shit version of the game, really, like I've done that all the time, and you just bring the shit version, but it shows off enough of what your idea is. Like, because if your idea is, I want to make this game that fixes this one thing, like, I want to make Werewolf, but people don't have to shut up after they die, and then you solve that exact problem in the game, people will see that that works really well, and then you're then now trying to figure out what the adornments are to make the rest of the thing a solid product. And I think that is kind of maybe just the core about how I operate. I don't know if that's universal truth.
I think solving problems and picking something that works is a good way to start. Yeah. Sometimes I'm always about intent. Like, I'll come up with it. Like, so when I go to a playtest, I'll go, what I'm trying to do is this. I don't think I'm there yet, but or this is my first go at it. And by priming people with that, they're like, okay, yeah, you know, they can then sort of judge how far away you are from that concept or something. So sometimes, so that could be like, so it could be, this is what I think I've solved, or this is what I'm trying to do, or a little bit of that story of how you got there, you know? And so often,
yeah, I
like,
think that is important.
Yeah, we often talk about, oh, it's got this, and like it's a bit like this game and this game and that game, which can make you feel like you're sort of just stealing everything. But that's how you get ideas. I was
It's
listening
design,
to a podcast
baby.
today. Yeah, I was listening to a podcast today with Ian Livingston, the guy who invented fighting fantasy, and another great luminary, and they both said that all game design is just taking other ideas and moving them around, basically. It's a great way to start as well. You know, I've also run a seminar which is just how to make your first game, and what I say is get something you like and change one thing about it, and then test that.
Yeah, I've also said that a few times. Hannah and I got together and was basically like, all game design is you fixing something that made you grumpy about an existing game, and like repackaging it with a different theme that you like more.
Yeah, I mean, and that also gives you a motivation, because you're like, oh, I wish this was better, you know. And
because don't forget, as a player, there's really only so much, like beyond your wheelhouse that you can get into easily, right? Like, if I play something that's 99% Magic the Gathering, I will know how to play it pretty straight away because I have played Magic the Gathering, and I think that is kind of a universal thing for a lot of people, where that ease of access is going to make the game more enjoyable because it's semi-familiar. But it needs to be unique enough for you to, you know, validate it as a product.
Yeah, but when you the product dimension, I mean, there's a lot to be said for following formats because your audience is primed for it and they want more of it. And these days, because there's so many, they may have played one of these games, but they haven't played 10 of them. So they're not going to be like, oh, I've seen that before, right? There's not that many people who've played Magic and Hearthstone and Marvel and 5 other things, and then they're like, oh, this is all the same. The people who play a lot of those tend to be like, well, more. And the people who've only played one of them will be like, oh, this is a little bit different. I love it. yeah, I mean, it's uh, it's not you shouldn't be afraid of using these things that work, um, and starting on these sort of concepts, um, and yeah, especially because um, regardless of inventiveness, your market needs ways in. They need to
Mm.
understand things. And what's happening, particularly with the huge growth over the last 5 years, is that the market's actually getting a lot more familiar with at least some basic concepts. Like, they know some of the mechanics, but they also understand basic symbology. So if you have, some symbols for like hearts for health, they're going to get that. A
Mm.
coin for money, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and things like that. And I think it's also good to test with people who don't have a lot of that familiarity, obviously.
Mm.
But you don't want to suddenly go, oh, money in my game is represented with chickens because I want to be different. It's like, no, the audience is
Yeah.
ready. They know what a coin is. Use it, and that's also why you want to pull bits out of other games, right? And go, here's the
Well, it
coin
has to be
from.
justified, right? Like you can have chickens if it makes sense
Yeah,
thematically, and
yeah,
it's not like huge mental gymnastics for people to catch up. So I
that's
think
right.
that's interesting, right? Because there's like a whole existing, like ridiculously huge existing works that people
Yeah,
could have played and learned things of and learn mechanics, learn symbology, learn common tropes. And like some of that is because designers looking over each other's shoulders, but some of that is just because people have picked things because they understand that it's common and people will like relatively
yeah,
associate this.
yeah,
Often like colors do kind of the same thing. Sometimes it's symbols. But I think it's interesting because, and I think about this a lot, but humans can't really fundamentally understand the unknown and can really only get to something new through many steps,
that's right.
right?
Yeah,
So for someone to go a heart that's life, you go, okay, that makes sense because if you destroyed mine, I would die, right? That's probably
yeah,
like stage one or whatever. But then you go, this thing is really tough. It has two hearts. You're like, okay. This thing
yeah,
is really like you're playing a Zelda game. You're like, Link is really tough. He's got 15 of these motherfuckers, and you're like, where in him? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
eventually,
yeah,
you're just kind of accepting that this is just a chart or a
yeah.
graph of how dead you are or whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah. But that
Um,
first time through, you'd be like, hang on, where is he storing all these hearts?
yeah.
But once you get through that step, you're like, oh, and then you can make that connection. Yeah, yeah,
But, and I know this is kind of like a silly analogy, but I think that that same thing kind of works for every single concept that shows up in every single board game.
yeah,
Like, for example, in Catan, they're like, this is this particular location. You're like, okay, I understand from the real world that this is what a brick pit is, or
yeah,
this is how a quarry functions, or sheep need to eat a particular type of grass and therefore won't be in a forest, right?
yeah,
And so,
yeah,
like, relying on real world knowledge so that then people could play the game. But let's imagine 5,000 years from now when we've colonized multiple different planets and people are living on Mars, which has one biome, and they're like, how do I play Settlers of Catan? I don't have this unified knowledge of what these
mm,
earthly biomes are, right? And so I think about this kind of stuff a lot, where it's like, how does like I really identifying like what the communal knowledge is of something, especially because board games are so specialized
yes,
in
yeah,
the field that like how deep can I go in that, right? Like if it's for example a light family party game or the audience is younger, they've clearly had less exposure to a lot of these things. So simplifying it and not going too deep in that, kind of implied knowledge, I think is important. Or like if it's a
mm,
heavier game, you can make a bit more of assumptions on how much the player knows and stuff like that. I
yeah.
feel
I
like
think
I've
it's
gone off on a tangent a little
no, I mean, look,
bit.
I think that's a really interesting issue, and I think that's one of the reasons I'm
mm,
really fascinated by games. Is it's about
mm,
it plays with what we know and what we can understand and what we can shorthand because we have to represent these things very simply, and that's really interesting. And it does, but it also touches on, yeah, what can you assume about your audience? Which brings us back to playtesting. When I was playtesting Baby Dragon Bedtime, I
mm,
originally built that game with a very gamer present premise in that I wanted to make a real time deck builder, but the average person I tested with didn't know what real time meant, and they didn't know what deck building meant.
yeah.
So I stopped explaining it like that, and I had to get them through the idea of you picking up cards and putting them in the deck, and that was
Mm,
really important. because if I'd made it with just like put all that at the front, it would only have appealed to people who were really into deck builders or whatever.
Mm.
And that might have been fine if I can get it to that audience, but it was designed for an average family.
Mm.
So I had
Yeah,
to
the target market and that level
yeah,
of complexity don't match. That is actually a really good example, right? Because I do that kind of stuff all the time. So I Murders at Tilwood's Manor,
yeah,
the elevator pitch is it is a reverse murder mystery, which you could let's pretend we dismiss that, but it's a worker placement and drafting game,
yeah,
right? And worker placement is only means stuff to people that have played board games
a fair
before
bit.
a
Yeah,
fair bit, have at least played Carcassonne.
yeah,
You know, but I feel like drafting is like a bit more accessible. Like you'd hit TCG people and stuff like that as well. But and this phrase only existed because someone was like, "Can you describe it for me quickly?" And I'm like, "Oh, here's just a fucking long tagline of the shortest thing I think that would explain both the theme and the mechanics as fast as possible."
yeah,
And it's not great. All right. And so like maybe the average non-board gamer who would probably enjoy the game hearing this goes, I don't know what any of these words mean. First of all, what the fuck is a reverse murder mystery? I don't know what worker placement is. I'm pretty sure none of these people, the rich elites of the theme actually hold a 9 to 5, and where would they get placed? And
yeah, yeah,
is
yeah,
there a draft? Close the window. Like, what's what's really going on in this game? So I think a lot of the language that we use and how to communicate that is important. And I guess when you've identified what your playtest audience is, if it's just your family and friends, a lot of this kind of industry jargon or heavy board game specific stuff might not be helpful, like at all.
yeah, yeah. And that comes down to, I guess, the idea of a big part of planning to play test is not just figuring out what you want to test,
Mm,
what you want to feedback on, but who am I playtesting with?
mm.
Right? Who am I? And that's going to affect.
What's the event? Because I would build a different prototype if I was just running stuff around the house with my roommate or with friends, or
Yeah,
if I was bringing it to an event.
yeah. So this event that is on Saturday or today, I should say, when this is live, is mostly board gamers, heading towards heavy end.
Mm,
Um, but so there's things like I wouldn't bring any role playing games there, but every now and then someone might. But you're not going to get good feedback about that. You're
mm.
probably not going to get a lot of people who want to play a lot of party games or parlor games. Um,
That's interesting.
there'll be a little bit of that, but it's
Mm,
more for the people who really want to play something like PAX Premier or dig out something something a bit more heavy like that, like
mm,
Beyond the Sun or something from Ravensburger or something, um, and play for 3 or 4 hours. So if you've got, you know, um, they're going to be looking for a different, they're going to have a certain kind of approach that depends on that kind of hobby gamer. They do like heavy themes. But they like to play for a long time. They like to sort of pick things out, find, and they're also able to learn quite a little bit. They're used to long teachers, so you can go, oh, I'll bring the game that, or I'll explain it a bit further before I dive in. So you change your approach and your patter. Um, and yeah, they will know some of the terms they've got because they're across a lot of different types of games. But then you might be like, a couple of months ago, we were at the Powerhouse Museum, and they were just completely variety. Like some of them were really
mm.
hardcore gamers, but some of them were 10-year-olds who'd never seen anything but a computer game before. Some of them were parents who had no idea what was going on. And so that meant you had to be very different in what you showed them, how you showed them, and what you asked them in return.
Hmm.
Uh,
So I think
and
that's a good point, actually. I think, and I think we mentioned this before in previous episodes, but in how you read a person gives you
mm,
a lot of information about how you want to interact with them in the
yeah,
playtest. And I think what you just did just then was
yep,
was a really really good example of assessing what the people at the event are going to be like, and what does that mean for me bringing a thing there. Like if you're bringing a party game, that might be an obstacle. If you're bringing a role playing game, that might be an obstacle for you to consider.
yep,
In in the same way that you go, hey, everyone who wants to play a board game, and you look around the room and you go, okay, we've got Greg who only plays 4 out of 5 complexity things, and we've got me who only plays 1 out of 5 complexity. You know what I mean? And then you go, okay, how do we find a game that fits all these people, right? I think that exact moment is the kind of muscle that you're looking to flex when it comes to that 5 seconds right before they sit down for the playtest. And you're trying to figure out what is the best way to explain my game. What specific types of feedback do I think I can get from these people? Because if you recognize that they are a heavier board gamer or more experienced in like a particular type of thing, then you can ask more specific questions about certain types of stuff. And I think that's why playtesting with game designers is different from playtesting with the general public, because you can ask much more needlepoint questions and they'll give you probably more broad answers, but they'll be able to answer the specific things that you have, or like be on category a bit better. And I think assessing what the like as best you can, what you can expect from these people. Because I've been surprised before. I ran demos at the Powerhouse event, and I had a mother and son. The son was wearing a school uniform. I think he couldn't have been older than 10, and the mother, right? And they come down and they sit down and play my game, and my game's probably a 3 out of 5, maybe 3.5. And if they said to me, "Do you want to play a board game?" It's not the game that I would have suggested, right?
Yeah.
And they sat down and they were playing. I kind of just dumped all the information on them. I wasn't really sure how best to make it any easier for them beyond here's everything, and then we'll walk through this stuff so that you can see it in action. And then they picked it up really fast. They knew everything that was going on. And I didn't get the impression that they had played a lot of other board games, but they just happened to pick it up really, really quickly, and I was kind of surprised. But so obviously you can be wrong when it comes to your read, but I think it does help in advance. But one thing that Steve did last Tabletop Tuesday, he brings out this game, Caribou, Kangaroo, I think it's the other way around. Kangaroo, Caribou. I know there's a lot of animal names in it. Trying not to say cockatoo, as always. And he goes, this is the new prototype of my game. It looks really lovely. This is where I got it from. Shout out Launch Tabletop. And then goes, also, this is what I'm trying to test with this specific thing. I'm trying to figure out what I want to really do with all the rules thing. Is it too much if we just leave all the different rules in play, or do we just want to have one rule that bumps the next one off when it comes out? And we go, okay, as game designers, we have the objective beyond just playing the game is to observe this one thing in action, and then now we can give relevant feedback to that one particular thing. And I think that's like gamifying the playtests, and I think that game designers are really good at that. But I think for the general public, if you go, I'm interested in looking at this one particular part of the game, and they're like, I've never fucking played it before. How am I supposed to do that?
Yeah.
And then afterwards, you can ask that question. So if you played Kangaroo Caribou with a bunch of normies, and then they go, oh, that was really hard or really fun or whatever, and afterwards you go, do you think having 10 rules in play was a bit too much? And then they go, yeah, maybe, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, you either front load it for heavier, more complex people with more experience, or back load it for people that are a bit, like, you can ask specifically about the thing. If that...
Yeah. Well, that comes back to what we were saying about just trying to figure out the right thing for the right audience.
Yeah.
And as you say, you can always be surprised, and you should always be open to that. Just go, do you think you'll like this? But then you just go, okay, I think you need to play it first, or you know how much you can. And part of also, like, you can ask questions going in, like to try to find out more about someone, like what kind of games do you play? You know, what have you played before?
Especially if there's a specific game that has inspired your game, asking someone if they've played that before. Like really often, running demos of Castles of Clearer, I will ask if a player has played Love Letter before. Or asking if someone's played Coup when running demos of Spaceship Redoubt, because those games are fucking 80% the same. Because then you go, if you've played that, then this game is that game with this fundamental change. There you go, I've already learned these things, I just need to pick up this one more mechanic. And I think that's really helpful. Yeah,
so that you're onboarding them, and that's a lot of what this is. And I think we talked about this last week, is that you're being a teacher, you're trying to be a facilitator, as well as, like, you're there to learn things, but you're also there to make sure the person sitting in front of you has a good time.
Well, they're also technically a customer, right? Like, the person that plays the game and the playtesting goes, that was the coolest fucking thing I've ever done in my life. It's going to come buy your game. So you're kind of also always a salesman.
and that means you better be excited, and you want them to be excited. So I always try to
Mm,
find like some part of my patter that can appeal to them. And if I'm not finding it, I'll ask them some questions. So, like
mm,
when I'm promoting the score, the first thing I always like is, do you like heist movies?
yeah.
And if they go, yeah, I love heist movies, right? I don't have to explain the setting to them. If they're like, I'm not sure, I'm like, oh, did you see Ocean's 11?
Or,
And
or
trying
Kaleidoscope
to get away in
recently.
and
Yeah.
going, do you and that sort of thing. So you're trying to sort of find out what you're excited by. And the same thing, like if you've got a complicated war game, you're like, oh, do you like, you know, whatever it is? Have you played a lot of Risk or something?
Mm,
And they're like, oh, I love that. Right? You found a way to make them excited,
mm,
um, and that's also giving you information about your game, what excites people about it,
mm,
but it also gets them on your side. They go, oh yeah, I really like that. And we're like, this is like that. I'd love to, as someone who is, you want to make them feel not just involved but also smart. So like, as someone who's an expert in playing Magic the Gathering, I
mm,
really want your opinion on this.
yeah.
Um, and I also would stress that playtesters get credits in my game as well.
Mm,
So I'll always be like, can I get your name because I want to put you in the credits because you're really
mm,
helping me today. And people respond to that as well. Like you're exciting them about the game, but you're also going, I need, you're part of something with me. You're helping me, and I'm really grateful for that. And you get a credit. When I was with a lot of my role playing games, I always like whenever people are making characters, I'm like, these characters are going to go in the game. You will go down in history in the RPG for making this character, and that also gets them keen, and they're like being able to develop things like that.
yeah, I think rewarding playtesters that are the general public
Yeah,
with stuff like that can be really, really good. I
I
also
mean,
think that rewarding game designers' feedback is also really helpful. Something
yep,
that
yep.
I've done because I don't put any of that shit in like the rule book or like that kind of stuff, and I probably should.
Depends on the
Um,
game. Yeah,
but on the Kickstarter campaign, I have a really long list of thank yous of people that have helped me throughout the entire time. And I think at the
yep,
very least, that is very important. But pretty much anyone that ran a playtest of that game, anyone that came and helped me run demos, anyone that came to like events that I run and helped me do stuff has shown up in that
yep,
list, you know? Um, and I think engaging with playtesters in that way especially ones to the general public. Game designers are like, yeah, this is like the fucking 90th one I've done this year. It's not a big deal, my dude.
yep,
Is a bit different because you're engaging them in a different context, right? Like it's a colleague, they're not a customer. I think that's. I see a lot of people doing stuff that interacts with people in the industry as if they are a customer, and I don't mean like specifically
yeah,
the board game industry. I think this is a problem that happens all the time in industries in general. People that like don't fully understand internal, external customer, or like aren't great at marketing, and are just trying to like send all this other stuff out. Like I saw a tweet recently in like the video game dev space. People are like, yes, my follower list, which is entirely other video game devs, seeing all of my marketing posts and are totally gonna go and buy my game now, like kind of a thing. And it's like I think about that a lot when it comes to board games as well, because it's like me or Steve showing me his games, right? I'm gonna buy them anyway to support the scene, regardless of like him particularly going, Keith, you're gonna like this one. You have to say either kangaroo or caribou, and I'm like, shit, I'm in. You know, like whereas my motivation for it is different than the product, and I think that's going to be the same for a lot of other people in the industry, right? Where they go, I'm looking for your help to support me rather than the customer, which is I'm looking for your help to support me, but in return, I'm giving you
yeah,
this product.
yeah,
I've made this for you. I think is very different, and I think when it comes to playtesting, it's the same kind of mindset, right? Like when you're working
yeah,
with a game design, you're like, okay, we are working together on a thing. You're my colleague. This is the project. I have a presentation on Saturday where I have to stand
yeah.
up and deliver this to a bunch of people. Can you help me with my slides? Versus a random person on the street where you're like, hello, would you like to donate to this charity that I have? And they're like, good lord, I don't even want to make eye contact with you. And also you have to somehow convince them that your game is fun and also that they want to buy it. It's like really different. And
Yeah.
I think actually like a lot goes into interpersonal skills and
Mm.
reading
Yeah.
people and getting an idea for what's going on and stuff like that. But I also feel like you don't have to succeed at everything all the time. I do a shit job of nearly everything I do, and I get by just fine. I feel like rocking up with a shit game is fine.
Yes.
I often rock up with shit games, like very often, because my goal is different beyond selling a product, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
playtesting with game devs, having a shit game is fine because they will go, "Oh, this was the thing that didn't work," or
Yeah.
"Is this what you were trying to do?" Or maybe if we change this, it would fix it, and it's going to be a lot more constructive. And if you're running a shit game, if it was the general public, you can really like needily ask, like, okay, what was this thing that made you mad, or like was this the thing that you had trouble understanding? Or I think sometimes for you developing your skills, learning that way is going to be easier than having a fantastic game. Like if I'm running Wingspan for someone, saying, hey, I just made this game Wingspan, do you guys have any feedback on what you think could change or we could fix? I think it's going to be a lot different than if I had just something terrible. Like if I pulled out Monopoly and I was like, hey guys, what do you think about this game I just totally made? It's going to be very interesting and different.
I think having a shit game is something that you can also prep. Like I was saying earlier about that story. If you go, look, this is really early, it's not going to be great. So that you're managing expectations basically. Thank
Well,
you for
here's my
sitting down on my
goal.
table.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's when you want to be like, since this game might be the hottest thing, that's when you're going to emphasize, but you're helping me, you're giving me, I need your ideas right at this. This is a crucial stage when you'll have a lot of impact. And I'm going to ease you over the bad parts. I'm going to flag them maybe or something, or so that you know that that's coming up. You don't want to just go present something that's really half formed as something that's really fancy. And that sometimes you can actually overproduce a prototype. I've seen that sometimes where people have like already gone out and spent thousands of their own money on art, and the game is still half baked, and you
Feeling a
have a
little called
mismatch
out.
in the audience.
Yeah.
The audience is like, oh no. I mean, it depends on what your process is, but
Yeah.
your presentation of your game can affect the kind of feedback you get, and that's also true of rough feedback. Like I've often,
That's true.
because I'm just scribbling things down. People often treat my games like they're less finished. They're like, oh, it must be an early prototype because it's ugly, and it's like, well, no, it's the mechanics are solid. I just suck at art,
Yeah.
But
I think
the
it's
idea is that
a good point, actually. Yeah.
it affects how people react, and if as well as your game is going to make an impression on them, but you also have to manage their expectations and go and tell them what kind of position the game is in, and it's okay to say, look, this just has problems. This has got some things wrong with it. But
Or
thank
this
you
is
anyway for helping.
90% done and art
Yeah,
takes months. Like,
yeah. That's another way to go through it. Or, sorry about the art. It's not pretty yet.
yeah. Because I
As
got
long as
advice from Alan early on. A big friend of the podcast, Alan Cheshire, another Australian game designer.
love his work. Yep.
Yeah, and he gave me advice on my game Spirits of Carter Mansion, and he was like, unless if this game looks like it's complete, people are going to think that you want feedback on it. I'm like, but the game's done, and he's like, but it looks like it's a prototype. And I also, like, coming back to Ryan's problem initially, I came back to that piece of advice with him, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, if you can, because the prototype that he had was, I'm pretty sure, like a black and white, just like generic kind of text and like maybe some stock images and stuff like that. And I was like, if you can update the prototype a little bit to, even if it's just using a whole bunch of stock stuff, a little bit of graphics design, but getting it to a point where the things that people comment on are not things that, the things people comment on are things that you are actually interested in getting feedback on. Because if you bring out your big scribbly, here's my, like the neckties game that I really liked, like here's my big scribbly neckties game, and then you bring that up and people go, well, here's my critiques with the art, and you're like, well, obviously that's not what it's going to look like on the shelf. This feedback is not very useful to me. But if you run that same game and it looks perfect, right? Then there's probably no chance they're going to mention the art unless there's something egregiously wrong with it. And then when they play the game, they go, oh, this was the thing, or like this is the thing that standed out to me, because humans are really, really fantastic at recognizing outliers.
Yes.
And this is also another concept that I think about a lot, and I don't know like where it really, really stems from, but people are really, really good at recognizing outliers. And if you're able to think of your game like it's a data set, the things that people comment on, they think are outliers that don't fit with your data set,
Yeah.
right? Because you're trying to have
Yeah.
a nice little curve, whatever the fuck your graph looks like. And then you go, okay, here's my thing. And then you go, oh, this was a problem. Or I didn't enjoy this or whatever. And then as you're plotting the different things on the graph, you go, okay, well, this is actually kind of still within reason, like the range I expected for this. I can ignore this. But this thing, this horrible thing that happened, or this like fundamentally broken or misunderstood or whatever, you go, okay, maybe this is something I should address.
Yeah.
I don't know, that's probably a technical, really unhelpful analogy. But trying to identify what those outliers are, I think, is important.
Yeah, I think that comes back to what we're talking, what we've been going over again. Is that a lot of this is about expectations.
Mm.
You need to know what their expectations are, what kind of games they've played, what kind of gamer they are, what they think is going on. You need to manage those expectations, and that's done by your spiel, your art, your presentation level, how you teach the game. And what kind of game it is and what kind of game they expect. Like if they played a lot of Magic and your game is different in a particular way, they're probably going to notice that. But if they haven't, they might be like, oh, this was really different to me. And you need to understand that context. And that will affect, how you design the game, because a lot of what you're designing to is figuring out who your audience is. And as I said, if you're making something for someone who's played a ton of Magic, then those kind of feedback's going to be important. But if you're making it for a more general crowd, you need to know what they spot as important.
Yeah.
So it's what they're used to and what they're expecting and what they think cards can do. And that's really, so much of game design as well is about what do people think these cards do or these rules do. And that's why blind playtesting is so important, because you step away and they're like, oh, this seems like this card should do this.
And you're like, oh god, no.
Yeah.
Please, no. I've had a few moments like that where I've written something that I've thought was pretty ironclad. One of the rules in Murders at Seward's Manor is when you activate a location, a thing happens. So you activate this location, and it says, if you activate this and you don't have the last player marker, take it.
Yep.
If you don't take the last player marker, do this other thing. And people will go, I'm not going to take the last player marker. I want to do the other thing. I'm like, no, it's programmatical. It's not a choice. What do you mean? And I didn't realize that would be a problem for some people. And it's like literally a flowchart of what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's some of these things will absolutely blindside you. So a friend of ours, Eris, made it was a game for the for St. Vincent de Paul's, I think it was, and it was about trying to teach people about how money for poor communities around the world can enrich them and stuff. And originally it was going to be a collaborative game, but collaborative games are actually really, really new to people who don't play a lot of board games. And they found they kept hitting up that expectation. People kept going, but how do I win? I want to win. And so that was getting in the way of like the audience they wanted to target, who didn't know anything about the developing world, needed a way for individual people to win. So they had to go back to the drawing board and go, okay, we'll make it competitive.
That's interesting.
And that's just an example of, that your audience, you've got to figure out who it is and what they can tolerate. And sometimes you'll be like, I've made this really, really unique thing, and the audience isn't ready for it yet. They're just too many steps away. That's what we were talking about. I think it was last week, about when you miss your moment, you miss your window because the audience isn't ready for it yet. And that can absolutely happen. Or you'll get an audience, but it's a much smaller one because it's only these people who've gone through this kind of experience. And it's okay to design for those things, and those people might really love it. They're like, yeah, that seems like it's just for me. But it shrinks your audience, and that's what you have to deal with. And
so
other people then
that's a kind of an interesting kind of a segue, because I did want to bring up what I've been working on recently,
yes, go for it.
today more specifically. My last couple of weeks have been absolutely chaos since the Kickstarter campaign. My sleep schedule has been absolutely wonky, but
Yep.
people usually associate entering enlightenment through meditation, and apparently I've entered enlightenment through lack of sleep, where you know that state where you're lying in bed trying to sleep and your brain's like, here's 1,000 fucking ideas. I've kind of just been like that, just kind of droning through the last couple of weeks nonstop. And my very, very first game, Cutlass, the fucking game that the company is named after, has gone through this really interesting development cycle, right? And I thought it might be something worth bringing up while we're on here, because this is my day-to-day, right? And so the very, very first iteration of the prototype was my very, very first board game, and it was a big deck builder game, kind of like Dominion.
Yep.
Right. And I did a bunch of playtesting with it. I was kind of really happy with where it was, and I started getting art made for it. Okay. I started to get art made for the game. And then I was like, hey, I'm really serious about this. What do I do next? And I asked people for advice. And one of the pieces of advice I got was make a small game first. I'm like, okay, I'll put this on the bench. And I made Castles of Kalira, right? Which is set in the same universe. And then I go, okay, there's some clunky things about Cutlass. I'll leave it for now, and I'll work on some other small stuff until I'm confident enough to really come back to the big thing. And then a couple years ago, I came back to the redesign, right? So it went from being like Dominion to being more like Magic the Gathering, right?
Right.
And the main thing, it was like kind of like a deck unbuilder, where whenever you took damage, instead of a number going down, cards from your deck were removed. And the whole idea was that you were trying to hold on to your resources and use them as efficiently as possible, because your deck was going to just like run out constantly. I was like, okay, this was kind of fun, but there was some kind of clunky things, because I kept the core mechanic that Castles of Kalira has, where it's like if you play something face up, it happens right away. If you play it face down, it waits until you turn it face up through some other means to do a thing. And that persists still, right? Recently, I came back and I rebuilt and actually built a prototype and did some testing with Martin, another one of the local homies, and built out a whole bunch of stuff. Came up with this system because I think I mentioned this earlier. I played Wingspan, and Wingspan unlocked this thing for me that was like, this is exactly the mechanic that I want to put in here that fixes this part, right? Yes. And so I built that and I played that, and Martin had some really good feedback about some of the balance stuff that I had not considered. It had like a really big runaway leader problem. And I was like, okay, because this is not on my slate, I'm going to put it on the bench. Last night, now, I've been working with the same background artist for a few years now, and she's like, I've finished all this stuff for this project, what do you want me to do next? I'm like, oh, well, I guess we would go back to that stupid fucking pirate game. And now, well, actually, I maybe should go back and have a look at what the hell actually is going on with this. I pick it up, I look at it all, and I go, okay, here were the kind of pinch points of the last prototype that was played. Here's all of the art that I've accrued over all this time. There's like 42 pieces at this point. It's like still barely a prototype. And which is very unlike me, by the way. I'm normally very much the opposite. And I'm putting it all together, and I'm like rebuilding it into a new prototype and like solving problems as I go. Because lately I've been playing a lot of the Pokemon TCG, and weirdly the Pokemon TCG was the next level of like, oh my god, here's the unlock something in here that solves the problem. Because the main clunky thing that the last prototype had was that you were building up several categories of points to make 20 rather than like taking 20 from someone. And it was just constant mental load to be go, okay, this is 2, 3, 5, 10, and then I have this many, and then like I just destroyed your thing, I get a treasure from this, so the number of treasures that I have is adding this many, and it was just like too hard to kind of track constantly how much you had. And then so I've gone and I fixed that by changing a main thing, which meant that I had to change a whole bunch of the cards, built out the whole thing, did all this graphics design, and I was like, okay, great. I'm gonna go to sleep now. It's like 8 a.m. And then I woke up at like 7, because we record at 8. I wake up at 7. I go, I have an hour to get to Subway before they close. Go and get dinner quickly, sit down, and Steve's like, hey, here's what we should do for the podcast. And I'm like, yeah, great, let's go. This sounds great. But it's chaos, right? Like I feel like my personal journey when it comes to being a game dev is very different from the average person. But I feel like this one product in particular, I feel like is not going to be that different compared to some of the other stuff because it's the hobby designer game in me, right?
Right.
Everything else that I've done has been career designer, but like Cutlass has been the I'm gonna make a Magic the Gathering killer, and shit if I know that I've done that, but it's like Magic the Gathering meets Wingspan. It sounds like two weirdly different things to meet in the middle. But that's like something I've been excited about for a long time. This is a game that has like lots of lore and backstory. There's lots of key characters, and like I could like present a speech on each of them about like what happens in their timeline and all this kind of stuff. Because like the game's ready. It's just I've not been in my career ready to like commit to what it should be, right? And in this, this is tying it back to the when is something ready for playtesting, right? The very, very first version of the game that I did, I ran a playtest of it with some people. I did like maybe 3 or 4 with just like random people, obviously no one in the industry because I wasn't really part of the industry at that time. I was just kind of thinking about stuff. And the feedback I got was not really helpful. And then when I finally did meet members of the industry, I got career advice instead of product advice. And I think that's something that I do a lot now, rather than I go, well, if your career is to be a game designer, here's what I would do. And then I go, after that, I made like a different version. And that was the playtest I did with, this was entirely cringe. I hated every part of this. I'm in physical pain running this game for people. And then I made a more recent one, and I got much better feedback about that, where not only like my interpretation of playing the game was the mental load of this mathematics was too hard, but also there was like balance issues that I needed to fix and change. And then now finally, I've got a really nice prototype that I've put together. I'm going to print it out, and I'm going to bring it for the next Tabletop Tuesday. And then after that, we're going to be able to have a podcast episode where we can go, here's what was shit about Keith's game. here's the the what's happening and what's going on. So I think that'll be really interesting to like talk about like this one specific thing. Here's the what we put together. Here's the because we are recording on a Tuesday instead of Wednesday now, we will be at Tabletop Tuesday to record an episode. I have no idea what that's going to look like, but it'll be an in-person episode once a month. Which I think will be exciting. That could be a great time to start pulling in guests and stuff to absolutely. Start questioning people, because I'd love to do some more interview type stuff, or pick a person, pick a topic. Like there's a couple of other content creators that are starting to pop up doing stuff like that. Like the you mentioned Eris earlier, who's been running our podcast now, which is a bit like that, which is here's the one person, here's the one question.
Yeah, Materialize. Really good podcast.
I agree. I've been a big fan of that one as well, and they've been getting some fantastic guests on board. And so maybe we might get into some of that. That would be kind of cool. Even if it was like we like literally have a product in front of us that we can talk about. Would also be cool, because it would be a bit more like a playtesting session than a review. Because like as an average customer, I feel like a lot of the tabletop content that you interact with is like reviews and previews. Here's a finished thing. Have a look at it.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting, and maybe this is because I'm the customer in this circumstance, to see how something is constructed in that way, and see the kind of input that other people have on it and stuff like that. But that's some exciting stuff to look forwards to. Because I feel like lately we've been really discussion heavy. Because there's a lot of stuff to talk about. There's a lot of nuance to the job. There's a lot of stuff that just like I'm just thinking about regularly on the day to day, and I'm sure Steve is the same. Because we'll chat about a lot of this kind of stuff pretty ordinarily, Or I'll just complain about shit pretty ordinarily. And I think it's interesting to be able to voice these kinds of things so that what we're thinking about, you're thinking about, and maybe you, the viewer, learn something about this, or you, the viewer, has a solution to some of these things and can get in the comments and go, oh, actually, Keith, you're really stupid. All you had to do was this one thing, and then all of your problems would be fixed. I'm here for it. That would be great, honestly. But I also think that like just giving some transparency to what we're doing on the day-to-day, like I'm excited about this prototype that I've built. I am excited about these things that I'm working on. I am acknowledging the things that I've put together and have not worked really well, but because I'm aware of it, I can fix it. You know what I mean? And I'm putting all this stuff together. But that's kind of our time for this episode.
Yep.
Hopefully that helps answer a bit of the question when it's too soon to playtest or when you should start playtesting. I think we talked a lot about playtesting recently because I feel like as a designer only, that is a big part of helping you consolidate on the design.
That's also what we do a lot of day to day. We're either preparing for playtesting, or iterating afterwards. So it's going to come up a lot, and particularly we've had a few events. So, but yeah, look, next week I've just started having some ideas about a new strategy game, so I might talk about how I get started and the very first things I do. So we'll talk about that.
I'm excited. Keep some notes so that we do remember to do that because I'm really chronic about forgetting that kind of stuff. Because what we tend to do is like 5 minutes before we start recording, we go, "What the hell is this episode about?" Because we're getting there. I feel like we're doing all right so far.
Yep. Send us questions, send us comments. We'll talk about those, and we'll see you next week.
And we will see you next week. This is Day-to-Day Dev. As always, I am Keith Franks of Cutlass Board Games. This is Steve Dee of Tin Star Games, because I forgot to introduce us at the very start. But this is our podcast, Day-to-Day Dev. If you want to see more episodes, you can find it all in a playlist, or there'll be a button on the screen right now that will show you where the next episode is going to be, or some of the previous episodes. Maybe you just shop through and find something that you find is relevant, because I think a lot of it is really good content and worth having a look at. Maybe worth hitting the subscribe button. Just hitting that, just clicking. All right. Anyway, hope to see you in the next episode. Goodbye.
See ya.